All right, so welcome everybody. I am going to share out a, does this sound good?
Yeah.
Okay, I'm going to share out about an iPad project that we started last year with teacher education candidates, and just tell you where we're at in terms of the research and what we're doing with it. We were hoping to have much more robust data to share with you. But one of the things that we're finding is recruiting students, and then also we've had a low enrollment of students in the teacher prep program, so it's challenged us in different ways. But we're making do with the students that we have and the students that have been participating. So my work, and I say ours now because there's a graduate student that's working with me. She's actually out in the field. She's an intern in teacher prep, and she is working at a charter school this semester, and so she was really bummed that she couldn't be here. But we actually did write a proposal, and if it gets accepted to ARA, we're going. And I told her we're going because she's been really instrumental in helping me figure this through. And then I've been collaborating lately with Dr. Vahid, who's in the back, in terms of me not teaching the course, but actually continuing the research through his participation and sharing with the students the possibility of this. So our study was motivated by two things. One is we talk a lot about, on the marketing side in teacher preparation here at GSCP, about how much our students identify as being the professional educator when they leave. And one of the things that I was interested in looking and starting this project was what was actual data that we could point to in which the students are going from this candidate student-teacher identity to the actual professional educator. And the other was looking at what happens if we actually put the technological tools in the hands of students as they go through the pre-service teacher program. Because what we know in, and I want to talk a little bit about the state of technology in schools, is that that there's a disparity and actually probably a lack of understanding about how to use this. And I'm talking about K-12 public school settings, because there's very different contexts and situations for where technology happens and how it happens. So these are two different classrooms. This is actually an elementary school up in the high desert in Victorville. It's a really cool setting for elementary school students to come in here and do science and technology education. There's screens that drop down. They do exploration of space. There's computers all the way around. It's air conditioned. It's nicely furnished for elementary school students, and they have a lot of fun and they do a lot of exploration in there. This, on the other hand, happens to be a high school in the valley that happens to be Van Nuys High School, and that's the state of the educational technology computer lab. So there's these big disparities in terms of what students have access to and what they're able to create. So imagine being in this setting and being asked to be creative, and then be in this setting and being asked to be creative. Notice how everything's so compact and very little space. And so I was actually in this classroom working with a teacher last year at the high school. What do we know about schools and technology? We know that for too long, public schools have been giving school teachers technology tools in which they're required to use, often with very little training and rationale for how to use this technology. In some contexts, again, depending, there's this disparity about how that happens and how it gets rolled out, depending on which district and who's part of the administrative team that's going to be doing this. But for the most part, what we found is this inconsistency around how to share those technology tools with the teachers that are actually working with those tools in the classroom. And then in addition to that, the training that goes along with it. So not surprising that this kind of rollout of technology has led to resentment, misuse, and underuse. I was working with a teacher last year who got a new assignment in an elementary school in the Inland Empire. And just by happenstance, just because she's doing science and education, she wasn't necessarily doing technology, but went to the principal and said, "Aren't there any more resources you can share with me?" And the principal said, "Oh yeah, we got iPads 2 years ago, they're in the closet." So the way this gets rolled out is really inconsistent, and so this one teacher said, I'll take them all. Okay, to overcome these obstacles, we must persuade teachers that technology will empower them and help their students learn. And like everything in education, we always point to the pre-service teacher development phase, meaning us, those of us that are in the profession of training educators, people that are going to be in the field as teachers, as a place where we could be doing this. So I have a colleague that does parent education, and he's been, this is the time and the place where we can actually help our pre-service teachers develop knowledge about what that looks like. Handheld devices, no surprise there, have been the most popular devices in K-12 setting and public school setting. But we've done very little to look at the systematic approach of how those handheld devices are being looked at or used. And when it comes to handheld devices, iPads are by far the most popular in terms of the use of them out in schools. If you are familiar with K-12 educational setting, or you picked up the paper and read something about what's happening with technology in education, you may know that, well, this isn't the one that I was going to show you, but I think it's a little bit later. 2015, 2016, the state of California went to standardized assessment all online, meaning that anybody in a K-12 public school, in the years that we collect data about how students are doing in terms of their academic development in these settings, data assessment is being collected through online technology. So meaning students are sitting in classrooms just like this and doing their state assessment on a little instrument like this. You may also remember that in 2013, LAUSD decided to roll out iPads, an iPad for every student, and then 2 years later they had to pull out of it because there was a lot of problems in terms of how the process, the bidding process, and not a lot of thought into the infrastructure in which students were going to be using this. So here we are in the pre-service program. And one of the things that we decided to look at is, hey, so since iPads seem to be the most popular device that schools are using, and they're using it for these variety of tools, we need to think about how to work with our teacher ed candidates and getting them to have this background. So again, their professional identity, and then also iPads. So to get to the opportunity to purchase these iPads, I wrote a grant, and it was awarded in 2015. And in the 15-16 academic year, we spent a lot of time setting up the infrastructure of what that was going to look like. So IRB, equipment, who knew that ordering equipment was going to take us a while, and developing a data collection plan for our students. Like, we knew we had some ideas and some thoughts, but really what was that going to look like? So we launched last year. We had our recruitment flyer and a recruitment essay, and we essentially told all our teacher ed candidates at the orientation, hey, there's this opportunity for you to participate in an ongoing research project. You don't have to do anything different than what you're already doing for your clinical experience courses. Meaning, in clinical experience courses, they have to do a series of assignments. They didn't have to do anything different but share their observation and reflection data with us. This is what our data collection looks like. So students enroll in the teacher preparation program in these clinical courses, and they have to do a series of assignments. One is observation, and then reflections. Reflections on how, what they're experiencing, what they're learning, how they make sense of what's happening in the field. We actually have a series of reflective and observational prompts for them to look at, and I'll talk a little bit about that as we go through that. So they have 3 clinical experience courses as they go through the program. They start off in term 1 with what we call clinical experience 1. They're actually placed in the school setting, and then they come to the university once a week and they debrief about how that experience is going, what they're learning. They're there most of the week and working in small groups. It's a developmental approach. In the second term, they're doing the same thing, but they're going full days, all the days of the week, and they're taking over 50% of the instruction. And then the only difference between Clinical 2 and Clinical 3 is that they have to do full takeover at some point where they're like essentially planning. They're the teacher of record. It used to be 2 weeks, and now it's moved up to 4 weeks. Is that correct, Dr. Vihi? So the state has required us to increase the amount of time that the students are taking over. So this is the kind of setting that is a context for how I'm looking at the data. I apologize, this is teeny tiny, but this is what I'm looking at in terms of data collection. So in term 1, there's always going to be a community, a school, and a classroom focus, meaning what is it that they understand about the context of the community and the schools that they're working in? What about the school setting? How is that particular school setting? What are they learning about the school setting? What are they learning in terms of parents? What are they learning in terms of accommodations and support for students with special needs, English learners? And then particularly to the classroom level. So what is it that they're learning in terms of pedagogy from their master teacher, and what are they doing in terms of that teaching? There's a series of reflection prompts, and then there's a series of questions that we ask them related to the use of technology, particularly this iPad. So we have similar prompts in terms of observation and reflection for term 2 and term 3, except that they get increasingly more complex, meaning we're asking them questions that are really getting at what are you learning? They move from one school setting to another school setting, from Clinical 1 to Clinical 2, or depending on when they start, because we have continuous enrollment in our program. But they're always going to be at 2 different school settings. And then again, technology, and then we end in the final term with a series of writing prompts, and then use of the iPad. So let me get to the data now, and let me share out a little bit of what we're looking at. So initially we thought, hey, everybody's going to be excited about this and they're going to want to come and participate. What we're learning is that probably a lot of the students probably already have some kind of tablet or iPad that they're already using. So the novelty of getting one for use in the experience as they move through their teacher prep program isn't what we thought it was going to be. The other is that one of the things that we're finding is that we tell them, well, I'll talk about that a little bit in the findings, but we tell them that we're going to be collecting this data. So I think there's a little bit of trepidation in terms of sharing all of that information for research purposes. I don't know. But what I'm going to talk about is data for the first year, and I'm going to be looking at 2 students. So this is over a whole academic year. So they start off in the fall, they move through a second term in the spring, and then they end in the summer. And currently we've changed our regulations given what the state is asking us to do. But previously, we would accept students into our program, and if they hadn't passed state-approved assessments to move into their Clinical 2, they could continue in the program, but they wouldn't necessarily be in clinical experience. And so that's what's happened, is some students have fallen out of the project even though they're still working with us, and then they've rejoined the project when they're eligible to be in that Clinical 2 experience. So for the first year, I had 2 students that were working with me, a male student, Asian, secondary subject, social science, worked at an LAUSD middle school and then moved into a charter school. And then the second student is a female Latina, was at a multiple subject, elementary bilingual, LAUSD, 2 different schools, and is now doing a long-term intern position, meaning they get hired by the school district and they're now doing their clinical practice and also getting paid for it at the same time, because they've met some of the state requirements. And this is a group that's composed of my second set of students that are now participating in the project. They're still in the process of completing. They'll be done later this year, so that data is still in the process of being collected. One of the things that I've been doing with their reflections is working, obviously from a qualitative research perspective, but looking at reflective journaling. This is part of work that I've done in the past. and continue to do with this particular project. So really looking at what it is that they're writing in terms of their reflective journals, and how that gives me some insight into how they're moving through this developmental process as educators, given some of the writing prompts. So again, this is teeny tiny. This is my male student from last year, and one of the things that I wanted to showcase with this is in the first part, in the observation, they're writing a lot of what they're seeing in the field in terms of, and they're using these tools to collect all their data. So they're just taking it all in. They're writing a lot more in terms of observation than in reflection. And one of the things that we've started to see as we move through an analysis of all of this data and all of their journals is that their reflections are becoming much more extensive as they move through phase 1 into phase 2. That's a good thing. And I'll talk a little bit more about those reflections and what they mean. But really getting into questioning and understanding like their role as a pre-service teacher and what their their efficacy as they move into these roles where they have such big responsibilities, especially in this case where the student ended up having to be at a charter school in South Central LA with lots of responsibilities. And one of the things that he points out in his reflection in terms of schools here is that he was surprised that students were in this particular context where he was doing clinical experience, where there was very little initiative from his high school students in his history social studies class, that students weren't doing work or assignments or writing until the teacher prompted them to do that. And he was kind of surprised and flabbergasted by that. He's like, what? They're not doing high critical lesson experiences. And the things that he's writing about in his reflection is mentor teacher really talking to him and saying, hey, look, these kids have different kinds of background and experiences, and you need to meet them where they're at. The other thing that we found is sometimes they don't turn in their assignments, right? So we don't have the similar observation and reflection, but we're looking at other things in terms of what they're learning in schools. Like I said before, our project I've come to some preliminary conclusions in terms of the data that I'm looking at and how to move this forward in the subsequent years. And right now, one of the things that I should probably caution in terms of my own thinking as I move through this is that my data sets are really small, right? So I don't have a lot of data to work with. But as we move these students through the ones that are in the process and in the pipeline, we'll have more data to look at from beginning to end, and then also how they're using these tools. Initially, we thought it would be great if we would have these face-to-face sessions when they were debriefing. And what we found is that everybody's so busy in different contexts and in different school settings and placed all over greater metropolitan Los Angeles. And so as a result, we ended up going online and having these virtual sessions in which we were debriefing. So we have collected some of that Adobe Connect data, and we'll be looking at that to analyze. And so some of the things that we're now talking about as we move into the second phase of this work, as we finish out these students and think about how to push out this experience with the students that are going to be coming in probably in January and then again next year, is that the evidence of a developing teacher is not clear, because I think one of the things that we've been talking about in that clinical experience class is that we had very, very specific writing prompts. We wanted to get at certain type of data, and I think that one of the things that we've started talking about now is that we need to leave that a little broad so that we have those very specific writing prompts, but then have more opportunities to do more open-ended suggestions on what they're seeing and finding in the field. The iPads that we issued to the students, they come pre-assembled and uploaded with apps and programs. We did some research in terms of what kinds of apps are out there for teachers to use, and for lesson planning, for videotaping, and so we preloaded them and said, this is yours for the academic year to use for all of your academic assignments here and for everything that you're doing in the field. One of the things that we're finding in terms of the feedback that we're getting from students is that, well, in my school, they're not using any of those apps. They're using these different apps. How do I get access to them? How do I use them? So leaving it a little bit more open and less restrictive for them to be able to adapt that given their context. The training and the orientation is a must. So initially we said, hey, here's the iPad. Go ahead and take it. Here's a series of apps you can use. This is how we use them. But the opportunity to actually use these for the kinds of activities that we wanted them to be able to use them for. So if, for example, lesson planning, and then actually showcasing their lesson, we found out that we're going to really need to take more time to help them develop those skills, because it doesn't come natural and they didn't have it, and they may not be translating the information from their curriculum course into the opportunity to use these tools. And that's what we were talking about, learning, integrating learning from what they're doing here into their other courses in the program. So what are our next steps? We're going to interview the participants as they get ready to leave the program about their experience both with technology and where they're at in terms of their identity development. Ideas that we've had is follow the teachers into the field. So let's really see what the impact is once they're actually the full-time instructor of record, and then to continue to analyze the tools. So, the data. So that's essentially it. That's where we're at, and I'll just open it up for questions or comments. So I thought it was really interesting earlier in the iPad session that we were in there, because I went to go talk to the consultant, that he was saying, you know, there's the training needs to be really robust in the beginning, and those are kinds of things that we're now learning we have to have with our teacher ed candidates as well.
What kind of training do you think would be helpful?
I think using the curriculum, there's a series of apps in here about lesson planning and building curriculum guides, and then how to use those, because when they go into their classes, like in curriculum and development, they have a very specific structure, and they don't see the connection between what this app can do for them and how that structure can actually help support that.
Can I comment to what Dean Williams said during lunch, which is, you know, you have a device, but how do we really use it in a way where you can maximize, you know, a certain app or a combination of apps to deliver the results you're looking for. I think that really continues to be the challenge. You know, and also to kind of share with everyone over here, when we were actually prepping this for your pilot program, you know, we had to keep in mind that to have something called device management, so that we at GSCP were controlling what apps they could or could not download, because again, because it is a part of a Pepperdine project, that we just couldn't allow students to do whatever they wanted with it. And I'm not sure if that could be the reason why the adoption was a little bit lesser, if they wanted to use their own devices. I'm not sure, but I mean, there's some risk management involved from a technology perspective as to what we can or what we cannot allow them to go ahead and download. So, you know, maybe opening it up and having a discussion with them, and then basically pushing those tools out, because there is so much out there. Yeah, we have a training session for the new group of students that are going to be part of this project, and my GA on this project is actually going to be the one leading that session, because she has a series of apps that she's already started using for lesson plan development, for units, for resources, and going to show all of that can be shared. But also, she's bringing back ideas of how to make this tool a little bit more adaptive to the particular settings. So yeah.
As far as integration,
And I'm wondering if you trained the faculty about the different apps that you are, showcasing to students, because if they mention the connection between an assignment or a task with the app, then that might strengthen those connections and the integration of those apps throughout the program.
Yeah, that's a good point. We rarely have opportunities like this to sit and actually share each other's work, right? So, so I think that now that we have started this conversation, we need to bring it back to our program and have connections about how we're using these different tools and how they might be able to use across the program.
Did you run into any support issues in the course of the program?
Support?
Like just problems with the hardware? I tend to think about things from a hardware perspective.
Not necessarily. I think our students are, it's like what was shared earlier at lunch. They come in having some background in how to use tablets and smartphones, and this is kind of similar. It's how to use it for educational purposes is some of the work that we're doing through this project and in teacher prep. So not really hardware specific, unless they were in classroom settings out in their clinical practice where they didn't have access to internet. Sometimes our candidates, depending on where they're at in terms of their field work experience, some districts and schools are, here's the password, use it and make use of it for whatever you're going to be doing with the students. And other districts are, no, you can't unless you're part of you're an employee, you're part of personnel. That seemed to be major disruption. Like, I don't have internet access, so then they had to resort to notes rather than Google Docs where they were taking notes.
Any other questions? Well, thank you very much.
Thank you.